One moment I was a history teacher, marking papers and planning a weekend trip to the coast with my 7-year-old daughter, Rhea. The next, the world was a black void that smelled faintly of dust and cheap cleaning fluid. It was swift, clinical, and utterly terrifying. When the local news reported a missing woman and her child, I knew the talk would be of a simple kidnapping, a robbery gone wrong. If only they knew the sickening, twisted truth that lay behind the locked door. The truth was, the one who took us was not a monster from the shadows, but a face I had known from the third row of my high school classroom, Aditya. He was brilliant, quiet, always eager for a good grade, the kind of student every teacher prides herself on. But somewhere along the years, that bright mind had twisted, the respect replaced by a chilling, obsessive devotion. It wasn't love, it was a hungry, possessive need that felt inhuman. We woke up in a room that was less a room and more a sealed box. The window was boarded up from the outside, and the single heavy wooden door was secured by a deadbolt I could hear rattling with every frantic breath I took. The air was stale, the silence thick, punctuated only by Rhea's tiny, suppressed sobs. Every ticking second echoed with the sound of a death knell. The terror wasn't just physical, it was in the unpredictability of our captor. When Aditya first appeared, he looked exactly as I remembered him, perhaps a little taller. He held a tray of food, plain bread, a jug of water, and spoke in that courteous, almost deferential tone he used to ask questions about the French Revolution. "Mrs. Verma, I hope the accommodations are adequate. I only want the best for you." His eyes, however, told a different story. They were dark, flat, and devoid of the light of reason, burning with an intense sense of entitlement. On the small chipped wooden table, our only furniture besides a thin mattress, he had placed an object that solidified the nightmare: a cold metallic knife. It was pristine, gleaming under the single bare bulb. It wasn't put there for use right away. It was a constant, stark reminder, a silent language that promised, without a single word, attempt to leave, and death will follow. The nights were the worst. The slightest whisper of the wind outside seemed to merge with the terrified catches in our throats. Rhea would tremble, her little hand gripping mine. I would gently press my fingers to her mouth, shushing her urgently. Even a muffled whimper could bring him back, and any sound, any disturbance meant immediate danger. His appearances became a torturous routine. One moment, he would be the charming, if slightly awkward, former pupil, discussing my career and asking if I remembered his perfect score on the final exam. The next, his face would transform. His eyes would redden, a twisted, predatory smile playing on his lips, and he would loom over me, asserting his absolute right and control. I felt less like a person and more like an object, a trophy locked away by a shadow that had forgotten what it meant to be human. The days blurred, dragging us into a deeper abyss of darkness. Hunger mingled with the mounting panic in Rhea's eyes. Time, sunlight, the outside world, it was all dissolving. All that remained was the crushing weight of captivity, where every passing moment was a fresh brand of fear. I knew this wasn't just a physical prison. This was the beginning of a sick psychological game, and I had to find a way to win. The first part of the nightmare had been the sheer panic of capture. The second part was the slow, insidious rot of the mind. Days bled into nights inside that sealed room, and the initial shock gave way to a weary, constant vigilance. We existed in a terrifying state of suspended animation, where every moment was predictable yet held the potential for brutal change. Aditya's visits became the focus of my entire existence. I studied him, desperately searching for the boy I had taught, a flicker of humanity I could appeal to. But the boy was gone, replaced by an obsessive, hollow-eyed stranger. He spoke often of his love, a word he used with a chilling possessiveness that made my skin crawl. "You were the only one who truly saw my potential, Mrs. Verma," he'd say, his voice soft, almost wounded. "I had to keep you. I had to make sure you were mine." This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. It was a desperate, twisted pursuit of control. He needed me to acknowledge his genius, to be his sole audience, to validate his entire warped worldview. I realized he wasn't just holding us prisoner, he was trying to imprison my mind, my will. My defense became a silent mental chess game. I used my past role, the teacher, as a shield. When he started to talk about his plan or his future with us, I would shift the subject, subtly challenging his reasoning, forcing him to defend his actions with logic rather than emotion. I hoped to create a small psychological crack, but he was too sharp, too damaged. He would let me talk, his lips curling into that unsettling, arrogant smile. Then he would drop a threat, quiet and precise, always centered on Rhea. My daughter, my brave little girl, was the reason I fought. She faded a little more each day. The light in her eyes was replaced by a look of permanent, quiet dread. I would whisper stories to her about the sea, about flying, anything to keep the outside world alive in her imagination. The food he brought was barely enough, and the hunger on her face, mixed with the terror, was my greatest agony. To calm her, I had to be strong, unnaturally so, but inside, I was crumbling. One night, desperation spurred me. While Aditya was gone, I used a broken piece of a plastic cup to meticulously scratch a tiny, faint message into the wooden door frame. A single, barely visible letter. It was an act of rebellion, a microscopic attempt at communication, so small I thought it might escape his notice. The next morning he arrived not with food but with a piece of sandpaper. He knelt by the door and slowly, calmly, smoothed the entire frame until the wood was pristine. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. He just cleaned away my hope, then straightened up. "It's not good to try and damage things, Mrs. Verma," he said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "It only makes things harder for us both." His act was a devastating lesson in his absolute power. He saw everything. He controlled everything. The psychological burden became suffocating. I started to wonder if there even was an outside world left, if we would ever breathe fresh air again. Then came the turning point. During his usual visit while Rhea was asleep, he became agitated. He wasn't talking about his obsession. He was talking about a sudden, unexpected problem outside, something about a loose end he needed to tie up. For the first time, I saw genuine fear, not just twisted entitlement in his eyes. His control, I realized, was fragile. In that brief moment of distraction, I saw my chance. I noticed a small set of keys dangling from his belt, the keys to our heavy door. If he was distracted by a problem outside, perhaps I could leverage the momentary chaos. The ultimate risk, the decision between quiet submission and a final, explosive attempt at freedom, was upon me. I had to be ready to act before the darkness consumed us entirely. The unexpected shift in Aditya's behavior, the sudden intrusion of external fear overriding his internal obsession, was the spark I had been waiting for. I knew the window of opportunity would be small, perhaps only a few minutes, but it was the only real chance we would get. I couldn't afford to hesitate. The following night, the air in the room felt heavy, charged with anticipation. Aditya came in, his face pale and stressed. He wasn't talking about my potential anymore. He was muttering about a complication, a police inquiry, a loose thread that absolutely had to be tied up outside. He was agitated, pacing the small room, his focus completely fractured. "I have to go, Mrs. Verma, just for a short while," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Be quiet. Don't move. I'll be back soon to resume our lesson." As he turned to leave, his hand brushed against the set of keys hooked to his belt, the heavy silver keys to the door. I had to create a distraction, something sharp enough to make him momentarily drop his guard, but not severe enough to unleash his full rage. I looked at Rhea, who was curled up, feigning sleep. She understood. "Aditya," I said, my voice shaking only slightly. "You keep talking about potential. But your potential was to be a great student, a good man. You threw all of that away for a lie. You are not a god. You are just a broken, selfish boy." My words hit him like a physical blow. His face contorted, that twisted smile vanishing instantly. His eyes, now truly red, narrowed on me. In a fit of uncontrolled fury, he lunged toward me, his hand raised. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he roared, the sudden noise a terrifying contrast to the usual oppressive silence. He stumbled, catching his foot on the thin mattress. It was a clumsy movement, but it was all I needed. As he momentarily lost balance, I sprang up, not toward him but toward his belt. My fingers closed around the keys, and with a desperate wrench, I ripped them free. The keys scattered across the concrete floor with a deafening clatter. Aditya's eyes widened in stunned horror. His control had been shattered. His focus wasn't on me, but on retrieving his symbols of power. He lunged for them. I lunged for the door. "Ria, now!" I screamed. Raya, faster and smaller, scrambled past him while he was preoccupied, snatching the knife from the table and tossing it uselessly under the mattress. It was a useless move, but it bought me a split second. I fumbled with the heaviest key, my hands slick with sweat and fear. The lock was stiff. Behind me, I could hear Aditya's ragged breath, feel his presence closing in. He let out a primal scream, not of a boy, but of a beast whose prey was escaping. The lock finally turned with a heavy metallic click. I shoved the door open just as his hand clamped down on my shoulder. The force was tremendous, but the door was already ajar. We burst out into a narrow, dark hallway. The air was different, cool, damp, smelling of old wood. He dragged me backward. I fought with a strength born of maternal fury, kicking out. "Run, Ria! Go!" Ria didn't look back. Her little feet pounded down the hall. Aditya finally managed to yank me completely back inside the room. The door slammed shut. I threw myself against it, trying to push it open again, but he was too strong. He had the key, and with a swift, brutal movement, he slammed the lock shut, trapping me inside. I heard the heavy sound of the deadbolt sliding home. Then silence. I was alone, but Ria was out. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening desperately. I heard hurried footsteps echoing down the hallway, the sound fading into silence. Was it him chasing her, or was she running to freedom? Hours later, the room was still silent, bathed only in the pale glow of the single bulb. I didn't know if I had bought my daughter freedom at the cost of my own, or if he would return for me after retrieving her. The truth was, in that moment, I had already won my private war. I had broken his control and protected the innocent. When the police finally found the hidden basement room, smashing the heavy door open hours later, the room was empty but for me. Aditya was gone. Ria was found nearby, shivering but safe. As the officers wrapped a blanket around me, ushering me out into the light of the real world, the victory felt hollow. I was free, but the cold weight of the prison lingered. I had stared into the heart of a beloved student's twisted darkness, and though the door was now open, I knew the walls of that psychological cage would be with me forever. The memory of the gentle-eyed student and the violent monster were fused, leaving behind a permanent, terrifying scar. Our town, nestled deep in the American suburbs, had always been defined by its quiet normality. During the day, it was a postcard. Kids cycled past white picket fences, families loaded groceries at the small market, and the air hummed with familiar, comforting sounds. But when the sun dropped below the horizon, an unnatural stillness would descend. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It felt like a held breath, a subtle, chilling tension that seemed to coat the streets. The shift began the night the white van arrived. I was driving home late from my shift at the local diner when I saw it parked 2 blocks from my house, right under a flickering street lamp. It was a standard boxy utility van, except for the things that made it utterly wrong. The windows were tinted a deep, impenetrable black, and there was no license plate, front or back. I slowed, expecting to hear the usual low thrum of a running engine, but there was nothing. It was silent, unnervingly so, as if it were coasting on a sheet of glass. I felt a weird prickle on my skin, a sense that I should keep driving, fast. A week later, Ethan Miller vanished. Ethan was 16, a good kid, last seen riding his skateboard home after dark. The police, bless their hearts, did the usual. Door-to-door inquiries, missing posters, a slow, methodical search. They treated it like a runaway or a simple accident. But those of us who had seen the van or felt its presence knew better. The panic truly set in when Mrs. Chen, who lived across from the empty lot where the van often parked, came into the diner. Her face was gray. She swore that when she looked out her window that night, she saw the van pull away. Not speeding, not rumbling, but gliding. She said that as it passed, she felt an invisible pull, a sharp, cold rush of air toward the black windows, like something was being sucked into the vehicle. The town's anxiety began to manifest in whispered theories. Some claimed the figures seen through the tinted glass were not human at all, but shadows, tall, unnaturally still forms. We stopped calling it a van and started calling it the White Silence. I became obsessed. I started taking my camera and binoculars out after dark, abandoning my own quiet life to track the vehicle. I spent hours sitting in my darkened car, waiting. Then, one night, I got close. It was parked near the old abandoned church. I crept up behind a thick oak tree, the silence of the night pressing down on me. As I aimed my camera, a shape shifted in the darkness of the front seat. It wasn't a shadow this time. I saw a hand, pale and unnaturally long, resting on the steering wheel. But what truly froze my blood was what I saw next to the van. Standing by the back door was a young figure, their back to me, looking utterly motionless and compliant. It looked like Ethan. As the van's rear door slid open without a sound, the figure stepped inside. There was no struggle, no hesitation. The door slid shut, and immediately, the feeling of cold, inescapable dread intensified. The van, without a sound, simply rolled away into the suburban darkness. I fumbled with my camera, my hands shaking too violently to capture a clear shot. I hadn't witnessed a kidnapping. I had witnessed an erasure. The way that boy had walked, the unnatural silence of the exchange. It wasn't physical force that took him. It felt like his will, his very identity, had been quietly snatched away. The police were bewildered. The families were heartbroken, searching fruitlessly. But I knew the truth was worse than death. The van was taking the children, but something inside it was stealing their childhoods and their memories, leaving them physically alive but mentally imprisoned. And as I watched the taillights disappear, I knew my life was now dedicated to finding where that white silence was taking them, before it came back for another one of us. The night I witnessed Ethan Miller's silent disappearance solidified my commitment. The fear in the town was palpable, but it was a fear of the unknown. My fear was specific. The White Silence was a machine of identity theft, and it was operating right beneath our quiet suburban facade. The police investigation, led by a well-meaning but baffled lieutenant, went nowhere. There were no tracks, no witnesses who could agree on anything beyond a white van, and certainly no ransom demands. The official theory remained a series of unrelated runaways or a highly professional, but utterly bizarre, human trafficking operation. I couldn't accept that. I knew it was personal, tied to the insidious atmosphere of the town after dark. I began to organize my own findings, cross-referencing the van's appearances with the homes of the missing. It didn't park randomly. It always appeared near adolescents, often those who had recently experienced some personal turmoil, a lost sports game, a broken relationship, a fight with their parents. It preyed on vulnerability. My breakthrough came with the return of Sarah Jennings. She had disappeared 6 months before the van's highly visible appearances began. She suddenly reappeared one evening, sitting quietly on her front porch swing. The moment her mother saw her, she collapsed in joy, but something was terribly wrong. I visited Sarah's father, claiming I was with a local support group. Sarah was physically unharmed, but she wasn't the girl they remembered. Her eyes were blank, completely lacking the spark of a teenager. She no longer responded to her name, instead answering to a simple generic sound like a bell tone. Her favorite memories, trips to the beach, her dog's name, were gone, replaced by a curious, placid emptiness. She didn't rebel. She didn't cry. She simply existed. It's like they took everything that made her her. Her father whispered to me, his voice raw with grief. The body came back, but the soul, the person is gone. That was the psychological horror at the core of the mystery. The children were not dead, they were erased. I started following the van relentlessly. My surveillance was exhausting, blending into the dark foliage, clutching my binoculars. I was determined to understand the why. Was it a cult? A science experiment? The figures I saw now when the van doors briefly opened were not shadows, but human shapes, dressed uniformly, moving with an eerie, synchronized precision. They were the operators, cold and methodical, overseeing the transference. They weren't monsters, but agents of a chilling, bureaucratic process. My focus turned from where the van was going to where it was staying. A vehicle that size had to have a staging ground, a place where the transformation was completed. I noticed a subtle pattern in the van's final route each night. It always headed toward the outskirts of town, near the decaying abandoned old factory complex, a sprawling area everyone avoided. It took 3 consecutive nights, but I finally confirmed it. Around 3 a.m., the White Silence, true to its name, silently slipped through a dilapidated side gate of the factory complex. Climbing the chain-link fence, I felt the sharp edges of my terror. This wasn't observation anymore. This was direct confrontation with the unknown. The factory was a maze of rusted metal and broken glass, illuminated faintly by the moon. I crept towards the largest hangar, where a sliver of light escaped beneath a massive sliding door. I put my eye to the crack. Inside, the light was stark, fluorescent white, and there they were, a dozen or so children, including Ethan, sitting on benches, their backs straight, their eyes fixed on a projected image, a soothing, repetitive loop of generic, sunlit scenery. Surrounding them were the silent, uniformly dressed operators. The air was dead. The children were physically alive, yes, but they were engaged in a terrifying lesson. An operator stood before them, holding up an object, a toy, a photograph, and uttering a new, flat word. The children repeated it, their voices a dull, synchronized monotone. They were being reprogrammed, their identities systematically dismantled and replaced with sterile obedience. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had found the lair, and I had seen the fate of the missing. But now, the terrifying realization, I knew too much, and I was deep inside their perimeter. I had to find a way to get out, and more importantly, a way to bring the world's attention to this silent, chilling operation, before I too became another subject of the White Silence. The sight of the children, blank-eyed and repeating their lessons in that sterile white hangar, was worse than any monster. It stripped the mystery away and replaced it with a cold, absolute dread. I hadn't found a ghost. I had found a process, a methodical, systematic theft of the human spirit. I had to get out. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew leaving without proof would seal their fate. Clamoring over some rusted equipment, I managed to get a shaky, grainy video of the scene through the crack in the door, enough to show the numbers, the children, and the unnatural, clinical obedience. As I turned to creep away, a loose piece of metal scraped loudly under my boot. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The operators, who had been moving with inhuman slowness, snapped their heads toward the sound. They didn't shout or look frantic. They simply started to glide toward the door, their movements smooth and relentless. They were not human beings reacting to fear. They were mechanisms responding to a fault. I scrambled, crashing through the outer darkness of the complex. My lungs burned, and the sounds of the abandoned factory, the whistling wind, the clatter of loose bolts, seemed to amplify the silent pursuit behind me. I didn't hear running. I heard the absence of sound, which was far more chilling. They were chasing me silently. I reached the perimeter fence and didn't bother looking for the gate. I threw myself over the razor wire, ripping a long gash in my side, but the pain was irrelevant. Freedom was the only objective. I finally tumbled down the embankment and onto the main road. disappearing into the cover of a thicket before collapsing. When I finally managed to contact the police the next morning, my story was desperate and disjointed. I showed Lieutenant Evans the video. It was poor quality, the figures were hazy, the children were distant, but the stark, organized nature of the room and the children's monotone responses were undeniable evidence of something profoundly wrong. Evans was skeptical, but the sheer desperation in my voice, combined with the multiple missing persons reports, forced his hand. That afternoon, a heavily armed police team, backed by FBI agents, descended upon the old factory complex. I waited by the perimeter, the blood drying on my shirt. The ensuing silence from the factory was deafening. After what felt like hours, the lieutenant emerged, his face grim. "We found the hangar," he told me, his eyes empty. It was completely clean. No equipment, no benches, no video screen, just dust and rust. "The children?" I demanded, grasping his arm. "Did you find Ethan? Did you find any of them?" He looked away. "We found 12 of the missing kids. They were scattered across the complex, just wandering. Physically, they're fine, but they don't know who they are." My victory was immediately choked by a deeper horror. The children were back, but the white silence had completed its work. They had no memory of their names, their families, or their lives before the van. Their minds had been meticulously scrubbed clean, their vibrant inner worlds replaced by a vacant stillness. They were shells of their former selves, technically recovered, but fundamentally lost. The operators, the system, the mysterious purpose behind the identity theft, it had all vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the broken pieces of a dozen young lives. Life returned in a grotesque way to our quiet suburb. The families took their children home, but their joy was poisoned by a heavy, profound grief. The van was gone, but the psychological fear it had unleashed remained. Every silent car that drove by at night, every flicker of a street lamp, brought back the terrifying knowledge that our secure little world had been compromised by something methodical and utterly heartless. I had saved myself, and I had brought the children home. But as I watched Sarah Jennings walk past my house one day, her eyes vacant and unseeing, I knew the real villains had escaped. And the haunting knowledge that the white silence could reappear one day anywhere to steal the very essence of innocence was the final, devastating sentence of our town's ordeal. Our small town was the definition of sleepy Americana, a place where the loudest sound after supper was the cicadas or the distant whir of a train. But everything changed when the silence began. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence. Every night, precisely at 9 o'clock, the town would simply cease to generate noise. The crickets would stop chirping. The distant traffic hum would vanish. Even the forced drafts in our aging houses would seem to halt. It was a suffocating, unnatural quiet that lasted exactly 1 hour, wrapping the entire residential area in a deep, cold shadow. I first dismissed it as an atmospheric anomaly, but the police reports made it real. The vanishings always happened within that hour between 9 and 10. It began with little Timmy Peterson, then Maria Santos a week later, teenagers, gone without a trace. The police, of course, were baffled. Their reports were meticulous. No forced entry, no footprints, no tire marks in the soft soil, no windows left ajar. There was simply the void where a child had been. I, like many others, started driving around after 9, my windows down, straining to hear anything. A car, a shout, a broken twig, anything to confirm that reality still held. But there was only the absolute deafening silence. The whispers started when old Mr. Henderson claimed to have seen Timmy Peterson near the school grounds, long after the boy was officially missing. He said the boy looked confused, lost, almost transparent, staring fixedly at something only he could see, his hands cupped around his ears as if listening to an unbearable sound. The police dismissed it as old age and grief, but it chilled me to the bone. They weren't just vanishing. They were somehow slipping back, incomplete, before being taken again. One night, I was stationed near the corner where Maria Santos was last seen. The silence had fallen heavy and oppressive for about 15 minutes. The air felt colder, and the streetlights seemed to cast weaker beams. Then, through the profound stillness, I heard it. It wasn't a car or a footstep or a human voice. It was the faint, clear metallic chime of a small bell. The sound was impossible to localize. It seemed to resonate from nowhere and everywhere at once, cutting through the silence like a splinter of ice. It had no echo, no reverberation, just a pure, brief, isolated ring. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that this bell was the key, the unseen engine of the horror. I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled toward the source of the sound, or where I thought it originated. I ran past the familiar homes, the silence making my own gasping breaths sound like explosions. The bell rang again, closer this time, almost vibrating inside my skull. As I rounded the corner, the sound abruptly ceased. The cold air intensified, and I could have sworn I felt a brief, subtle tug on my sleeve, an invisible, fleeting draft that pulled toward the empty lot by the old reservoir. I shone my beam into the darkness. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no physical bell. But there was a flash of something. A momentary white blur at the edge of the light, too fast, too shapeless to be human. It felt like a deliberate, dismissive shadow. It wasn't the children's captor. It felt like their shepherd. I stood there paralyzed, knowing the 1-hour window had closed. The distant sound of a single car engine finally broke the spell, signaling 10 o'clock. But the relief was minimal. The silence and the bell were linked to an unseen, unhuman power stealing our children's very presence. And I knew that to find them, I would have to follow the sound of that silent, ghostly chime into a mystery that defied every law of the world I knew. The silent chime of that bell became my obsession, replacing sleep and logic. The police were still hunting for tire tracks and interviews, blind to the true nature of the enemy. I knew the horror wasn't about escape. It was about erasure, orchestrated by something that moved with the absolute authority of the supernatural. I began mapping the incidents, noticing a chilling pattern. The bell seemed to ring strongest near places associated with childhood innocence: the school playground, the old ice cream parlor, the library. I spent the hour between 9 and 10 stalking those spots, camera ready, fear a constant bitter taste on my tongue. It was 2 weeks after the last disappearance that the first child returned. I was huddled near the community center when the dispatch crackled, reporting that Billy Harper, missing for 2 months, was sitting on his own lawn. I raced over. The scene was devastating. Billy was physically fine but utterly lost. He sat cross-legged, his pajamas dirty, his eyes holding a vacant, terrifying stillness. When his mother called his name, he didn't respond. When he tried to speak, his words were halved, mangled sounds, as if his mind had forgotten how to construct language. But it was the detail Billy's father gave me that confirmed my worst fears. He swore that just before he spotted Billy, there had been an odd, bright white blur next to the boy, a shape that was too tall and too fast to be anything human. It was a pure white, shadowy figure that simply dissolved into the night air. The shepherd I had glimpsed was real, and it had delivered its broken prize. The bell and the shadow were two halves of the same malevolent force. The bell was the signal for the removal of identity, and the shadow was the agent of exchange. I realized the children weren't being held in a physical place. They were being subjected to a psychological cleansing somewhere outside of our reality. They were coming back briefly, perhaps as a twisted act of mercy or to show their lingering power before the damage became permanent. My focus shifted from finding a location to finding the source of the bell's sound. I strapped on sensitive recording equipment and ventured into the 9 o'clock silence. Tonight, I was determined to follow that unnatural chime to its epicenter. At 9:15 p.m. the silence was total. At 9:20 p.m. the bell rang, a clear, cold cling, and I started walking. The sound was confusing, always seeming to come from just around the next corner, yet never getting truly louder. I was caught in a spectral chase, chasing an echo in a world devoid of sound. Then I saw him, Timmy Peterson, The first boy who vanished. He was standing alone in the middle of a deserted street staring up at the moon. He didn't look terrified, just profoundly confused. He was clutching a small, rusted toy truck. As I slowly raised my camera, trying not to break the silence, he suddenly dropped the truck and looked straight into the bushes where I hid. His eyes weren't focused on me, but past me, into the dark space behind. He raised a trembling hand to his ear, listening intently to a sound I couldn't hear. Then, the white shadow appeared. It materialized instantly beside Timmy, a column of featureless, intense white that made the surrounding darkness seem even blacker. It didn't move aggressively, it simply loomed. The bell chimed again, louder, faster this time. Timmy let out a small, strangled whimper. The white shadow seemed to envelop him, and in the space of a heartbeat, they were both gone. No running, no struggle, no sound. They simply vanished, leaving the rusty toy truck alone on the cold asphalt. I crawled back to my car, shaking uncontrollably. The image of that brilliant white shadow seared into my memory. The bell wasn't just a signal. It was a doorway, and the shadow was collecting the victims who were temporarily displaced. I had seen the true power of the force, and I knew that if I was ever going to stop it, I had to find where the bell rang from, before the hour of silence claimed another life, or worse, brought back another empty vessel. The glimpse of the white shadow and the sight of Timmy Peterson being erased were the breaking point. I had the truth, but I needed the proof and the location. I knew the factory complex wasn't the answer this time. The source of the fear was entirely non-physical. The bell was the gateway, and I had to walk through it. I theorized that the bell's chime was loudest, and thus the gateway most stable, at the exact midpoint of the silence, 9:30 p.m. I also reasoned that the bell's sound must be tied to a place that had been forgotten, where the town's emotional guard was lowest. That place, I decided, was the abandoned cemetery on the hill, old, neglected, and steeped in memory. That night, I didn't wait in the car. I stood right in the center of the old cemetery grounds, a camera and a handful of salt, a ridiculous gesture against a supernatural enemy, my only companions. At 9 o'clock, the silence fell, thick and immediate. 9:28 p.m. My hands were shaking too badly to hold the camera steady. 9:29 p.m. The air turned icy, smelling faintly of old parchment and ozone. At 9:30 p.m., the bell rang. It was no longer a distant chime, but a deafening metallic clang that resonated deep inside my chest, drowning out my own pulse. The sound seemed to emanate directly from the ground beneath a crumbling, moss-covered monument, a stone angel with half a wing missing. The bell wasn't the enemy. The bell was the signal. As the sound faded, the air in front of the monument began to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt, but cold. The shimmering intensified, and a doorway opened, a black, swirling void that looked like compressed darkness. From the void stepped the white shadow. It was taller than any man, featureless, its intense white shape absorbing all ambient light. It wasn't ghostly, it was solidly unnatural. Beside it, a procession began. The missing children, Ethan, Maria, and others, walked out of the void, their eyes wide, their movements wooden, like dolls being pulled by invisible strings. They were being returned, momentarily. The shadow raised a long, tapering hand and the children stood still. I realized its purpose. This entity of white noise was using the silence to pull the children into its dimension, not to harm their bodies, but to harvest the essence of their childhoods, their memories, their joy, their very identities, and return them as empty shells. I forgot the camera. I launched myself forward, screaming a name, Timmy's name, anything to break the spell. My human shout, so loud in the residual silence, shattered the calm. The white shadow turned its vacant gaze on me. It didn't react with anger or surprise, only cold, meticulous efficiency. The bell rang again fiercely, repeatedly. Clang, clang, clang. The sound wasn't meant for the children. It was meant for me. The metallic ringing was excruciating, a psychic blow that made my vision swim. I stumbled backward, clutching my head as the shadow began to advance. Just as the edge of the void started to stretch toward me, the town's clock tower, oblivious to the supernatural laws, began to chime 10 o'clock. Dong, dong. The noise of the clock, the natural sound of time, acted like a counterspell. The white shadow froze, its white light flickering. The shimmering doorway instantly collapsed, folding inward on itself with a sound like rushing static. The children, still standing near the monument, dropped to the ground as if the strings holding them had been cut. The shadow was gone. When the police arrived, summoned by my frantic 911 call during my escape, they found me bleeding, hyperventilating, surrounded by the missing children. The children were physically safe, but like Billy, they were vacant. They had been returned, but the silent bell had already taken its toll, erasing their pasts and their potential. The town's ordeal was over, yet the true horror remained. The silent hour at 9 was gone, replaced by the normal, comforting noise of the night. But every time a child spoke in broken, half-formed sentences, every time I saw that vacant stare, I knew the truth. The white shadow had been denied its final prize, but it had proven its devastating existence. And I live every night with the certainty that somewhere, in the dead silence between worlds, that unseen, cold bell is just waiting for the next opportunity to ring.